I'm Sergeant Claire Morgan. I've spent the last 12 years of my life in uniform, serving in places most people only hear about in headlines. I've led patrols through sandstorms, patched wounds in hostile zones, and written letters to parents I'd never meet because their kids never made it home. But nothing prepared me for what happened in my own living room, with my own blood. It was supposed to be a welcome home dinner. I baked the pie my dad used to love, wore the jacket my mom once said made me look strong, and walked through the front door hoping to feel like I belonged. Instead, I left that night knowing I never really did. The moment burned itself into my memory with perfect clarity. My brother leaned back in his chair, half smiling, and said 10 words that ended everything. "Why would we tell you? You're just a soldier." Nobody flinched. Not my mom, not my dad, just me, sitting there with a forced smile and a pie no one asked for. I didn't yell, didn't cry. I just stood up, placed my napkin on the table, and walked out. Not in anger, but in clarity. That was the moment I stopped bleeding for people who didn't notice the wound. This isn't a story about betrayal. It's not even about family. It's about the long road back to yourself, when the people closest to you draw the first cut. I used to think silence kept the peace. Turns out, it just delays the fallout. What happened after that dinner unraveled everything I thought I knew about loyalty, love, and what it means to be one of them. If you've ever felt like the outsider in your own family, like you were performing for a seat at the table, then maybe you'll understand what I did next. And why I don't regret it. Not even for a second. 9 months in a deployment zone changes the way you walk through an airport. You move with purpose. You scan faces, not for danger, but for someone waiting to say, "You're home." But when I stepped off that plane, there was no one. Just strangers holding signs, reuniting with loved ones, while I adjusted the straps of my rucksack and balanced a foil-covered pie in one hand. I didn't expect balloons or cheers. Just maybe my mom, or even my dad in his pickup, the same way he used to surprise me at softball games in high school. Instead, I texted my brother, waited 5 minutes, then ordered a rideshare. The driver asked if I was visiting family. I said, "Something like that." The house looked the same, down to the dented mailbox and the porch light that flickered like a heartbeat. I stood on the front step a second longer than I needed to, gripping the warm pie tin like it could anchor me. Inside, the smell of pot roast and cinnamon candles wrapped around me, familiar but too perfect, like a staged photo. No one rushed to greet me. Mom called out a soft, "Hi, honey," without turning from the stove. Dad gave me a half nod over the rim of his beer bottle. My brother was already at the table, laughing about an all-inclusive trip he was planning to Cancun. I stood in the kitchen doorway holding the pie like a question no one wanted to answer. Dinner started without a single, "How was the flight?" They talked over each other about travel deals, booking apps, and beachfront views. I set the pie down beside the mashed potatoes. No one touched it. My father passed the salt without looking up. My brother bragged about a business deal he claimed he closed himself, one I knew I'd quietly helped float months ago. I smiled where I was supposed to, nodded when the conversation drifted my way, even if it was only to ask if I could pass the bread. I studied each face, looking for some trace of the people I used to love. Instead, I saw roles being played: the proud father, the cheerful mother, the successful son, and me, the outsider. The audience, they didn't know was watching. At one point, my mom glanced over and said, "It's nice to have you home," but it felt like someone reading a line off a script. No one asked about the base. No one asked about the soldiers I'd trained, or the dust storm, or the time I woke up shaking from the sound of a garbage can slamming in the wind. No one asked anything at all. I sat through the meal quietly, biting my tongue each time I almost spoke. I didn't want to make it about me. I just wanted to feel included. But the table might as well have had a wall down the middle. On one side, my family. On the other hand, I and a pie are cooling, untouched. By dessert, I stopped waiting. I watched the way they smiled at each other, passed inside jokes, like side dishes. I realized this wasn't about being forgotten. This was about not being missed, and that hits different. That's the kind of silence that doesn't echo. It just settles, heavy and clear. Somewhere, between the second glass of wine and the sound of my brother bragging about oceanfront suites, I found a moment to speak. The table had dipped into that lazy, post-dinner rhythm where everyone talks over each other but somehow still hears everything. I took a breath, smiled the way you do when you want to seem easygoing, and said, "Just let me know when the reunion is. I'll book early this time." It wasn't a demand. I said it casually, like it didn't matter much. Like I hadn't replayed the last reunion in my head too many times to count. The one I found out about a week after it happened, through a tagged photo someone forgot to hide. The words hung there longer than they should have. My fork paused halfway to my mouth as the silence stretched, thick and careful. My mother's hand tensed on her wineglass, but she didn't lift her eyes. My father scratched his chin and looked toward the TV in the next room, as if searching for a distraction that wasn't there. I waited, thinking maybe they hadn't heard me. Maybe I spoke too softly. I repeated it, just slightly louder, still with that practiced smile. "Seriously, just let me know the dates. I can request leave in advance." Still nothing. My brother reached for more gravy, if I hadn't said a word. The clink of silverware and the hum of the dishwasher in the background filled the space where a response should have been. That's when my stomach dropped, not from anger, but from recognition. This wasn't a missed cue. This was deliberate. I scanned the table, watching them all avoid my eyes like a game they'd rehearsed. I tried to convince myself it was awkwardness, maybe guilt. Maybe they meant to tell me, but the timing never felt right. I held onto that thought like a handrail, because if this wasn't a mistake, then it meant I'd been erased, and I wasn't ready to believe that. Not yet. My brother leaned back in his chair, that lazy grin spreading across his face like he was teeing up a joke. He looked straight at me for the first time that evening, eyes sharp with something that wasn't quite humor. "Why would we tell you?" he said, voice loud enough to cut through the table chatter. "You're just a soldier." The words didn't echo. They didn't need to. They landed with a thud, quiet and final. My mother kept her gaze fixed on her plate, moving peas around like they held the answer. My father let out a low chuckle, as if the line had been clever, as if it hadn't just torn through the center of the room. No one told him to stop. No one gasped. No one acted like anything wrong had been said. And that told me more than the sentence itself ever could. I didn't blink. I didn't flinch. I just stared at him, feeling the heat crawl up my neck and settle behind my eyes. But it wasn't rage. It was something colder. Shame. The kind that seeps in when you realize the room isn't just indifferent, it's aligned. The pie I brought sat untouched in the center of the table. I watched the steam rising off it, curling like it was trying to escape. I wished I could do the same. He turned back to his plate like the conversation was over, like he hadn't just stripped me of personhood in front of our parents, like calling me just a soldier, with some harmless tease instead of a weapon dressed in a casual tone. That's when I knew this wasn't about being left out by accident. This was intentional, deliberate. They hadn't forgotten me. They had erased me. And in that moment, sitting at a table where I used to belong, I finally saw it for what it was. I placed my napkin gently on the table, smoothing it with both hands like I was folding away the last piece of something I no longer needed. No one looked up. My chair scraped the floor as I pushed back, slow enough to make them feel it, even if they pretended not to. I stood without a word for a moment, letting the silence do what it does best. Then I nodded once toward my father, said, "Good night," like I was leaving a neighbor's dinner party. I looked at my mother, who still wouldn't meet my eyes, and gave her a quiet, polite smile. My brother didn't say anything. He just smirked again, already moving on to his next story. I didn't wait for anyone to stop me. I walked to the front door with steady steps, grabbed my coat from the hook, and slipped it on without fumbling. As I opened the door, I heard her voice behind me, soft and artificial, like a line rehearsed for guests. "Claire, stay. It's just dinner." I turned halfway, not enough to see her face. "It's a message." "I got it," I said, then pulled the door closed behind me. Outside, the air hit me like a truth I didn't know I'd been holding back. It was cold, sharp, honest. I walked to my car, the box of pie still warm in my hands. I hadn't touched it. Neither had they. The drive home was quiet. No music, no calls. Just the sound of tires on wet pavement and the steady hum of my thoughts finally lining up. The fog along the road curled through the headlights like breath. I tightened my grip on the steering wheel and let the silence sit in the passenger seat. I didn't cry. Not because I wasn't hurt, but because I was done asking for a room at a table that had clearly stopped setting a place for me. That kind of grief doesn't make noise. It just settles in and teaches you how to breathe differently. The pie sat untouched on the passenger seat. A reminder that some offerings aren't meant to be accepted. As I pulled into my apartment lot, the weight in my chest didn't feel like sadness. It felt like control. For the first time in years, I wasn't confused about where I stood. I was outside the circle. And maybe that was exactly where I needed to be. 3 days passed without a single word from anyone. No texts, no missed calls, not even one of those passive-aggressive forwarded memes my mom used to send. I told myself I didn't care, but the silence scratched at the edges of my resolve. On the 4th morning, my phone buzzed. Derek. I stared at the screen for a long second before opening it, already knowing it wouldn't be an apology. "Hey, weird question. Did your bank block the transfer? The loan payment didn't go through." No greeting, no mention of the dinner, just straight to business. I read it twice. My thumb hovered over the keyboard, and I felt something click into place. Like a puzzle I'd been trying to solve for years, it suddenly completed itself in 4 short lines. Every favor I'd ever done. Every check I wrote when they were in a bind. Every time I told myself that family helps each other. I wasn't a sister to them. I was a silent safety net, and when I stopped being useful, I stopped existing. I didn't get angry. I didn't even feel surprised. I typed 4 words, each one landing with the weight of a closing door. Not family. Not funded. Then I hit send and blocked his number without a second thought. My hands didn't shake. I thought they would, but they didn't. What I felt wasn't guilt or hesitation. It was control, the kind that comes not from power, but from finally reclaiming what's yours. An hour later, another message came through, this time from my father. I didn't open it. I turned the phone over and let it buzz against the counter until it stopped. I stood there in my kitchen, the same place I'd brewed coffee for them when they visited, the same place I'd cried over overdraft fees after bailing Derek out again, and I realized they never even saw it. The cost. Not just the money, but the part of me that kept giving even when it hurt. This wasn't a family that forgot me. This was a family that fed off me. And now that I'd stopped bleeding, they were finally starting to feel the loss. I pulled out my old laptop, opened the banking app, and started scrolling. Transfer after transfer. Some were labeled urgent. Others just had dates and dollar signs. At the time, none of them seemed like a big deal. A few hundred here, 500 there, 1,000. When Derek's business almost collapsed, or so he said, I printed everything. My printer groaned with every sheet, the tray filling up with black and white reminders of how I'd said yes too many times. I laid them out on the table, years of transactions stacked neatly, like a timeline of my silence. Then, I grabbed a yellow highlighter. One swipe across each line tied to Derek. To my parents. To emergencies that somehow always ended with me footing the bill. I thought it would feel like organizing chaos, but it felt more like walking through a wreckage you didn't know you'd survived. $200, $500, $1,000, $100. It all added up fast. The total climbed past $20,000 before I even reached last spring. I stopped midway through the stack, staring at the glow of all those yellow lines. Each one was a choice I made, a belief that helping them was how I proved I mattered. But now, Each mark was proof of how long I'd been paying to be included. It wasn't generosity. It was currency. I'd been buying a seat at a table that never had my name on it. By the time I finished highlighting the last sheet, the numbers didn't even hurt. What hurt was realizing how invisible I'd made myself just to be accepted. That clarity didn't break me. It focused me. I sat down at the kitchen table, papers sorted and highlighted, the numbers staring back like a quiet confession. No drama, no accusations, just facts on paper. I gathered them slowly, stacking each sheet like pieces of a puzzle I was finally ready to let go of. I slid them into a plain manila envelope, the kind you use for tax returns or final warnings. On the front, I wrote a single line in black ink, steady hand, clear mind. This is the cost of my silence. I didn't add a return address, didn't include a note or signature. I drove to the post office, walked in without hesitation, and dropped it into the slot. I didn't pay for tracking. I didn't need confirmation. The message wasn't about getting a reaction. It was about putting something down and walking away from it. That envelope wasn't a threat or a cry for closure. It was my final boundary, sealed and sent. As I stepped back into my car, I felt lighter. Not because the money didn't matter. It did. But I had finally placed the weight where it belonged, with them. What they chose to do with it was no longer my business. I didn't wait for an apology. I didn't expect one. Some endings don't need loud exits. They just need to be done. And this time, I didn't need to be heard to know I was right. The call came on a Thursday afternoon, just as I was finishing a report for base reentry. A calm voice introduced itself as Thomas Reed from Greenline Financial. "We're confirming your co-signature on a $10,000 business loan for Derek Morgan," he said. I sat up straighter in my chair, every word slicing through the air like a clean cut. "Excuse me?" I asked. He repeated it, unfazed. "Your name and signature appear on the agreement. We're just doing a final verification before disbursement." I didn't yell. I didn't panic. "I never signed anything," I said. There was a pause on the line. "Understood," he replied, his tone changing. "We've noted some inconsistencies. You will not be held liable. We'll be in touch." When the call ended, I didn't throw my phone or scream into the void. I just sat there, still as stone, staring at the wall, like it might answer the question I hadn't fully asked yet. My name. They had used my name. It wasn't just about money anymore. This wasn't borrowing or asking or manipulating. This was theft. Clean, quiet, and deliberate. It had my signature, but not my hand. I called a legal contact from my time on base. Sergeant Parson. She picked up on the second ring. I laid it all out, every transfer, the blocked number, the envelope, and now this loan. Her voice didn't shake. "That's identity fraud," she said flatly. "Document everything. We'll handle it quietly." That word hit me hard. Quietly. Not as surrender, but as a strategy, the kind of silence that carries weight. Not fear. Authority. I opened a folder and labeled it Paper Cuts. I filled it with screenshots, voicemails, and statements. Every choice they made now became evidence. Not for revenge, for protection. 2 days later, a cease and desist letter went to Derek's business address. Legal, final, binding. An hour after that, he emailed, "You think you're better than us now? You'll regret this." I didn't respond. Silence is its own kind of language. And this time, it was speaking with the full weight of the law behind it. I pulled up to Grandma's cottage just as the sky turned soft with early evening light. The porch light was already on, like she knew I'd come. Before I could even knock, the door creaked open, and there she stood, holding a mug in one hand. "Took you long enough," she said, stepping aside. No hug, no tears, no fuss. Just the steady warmth of someone who never needed an explanation to understand. I sat on her old couch, the one that smelled faintly of cinnamon and old books. She handed me the tea and waited. I told her everything, not in one long breath, but in quiet pieces. The dinner, the loan, the envelope, the silence. She didn't interrupt. She didn't offer advice or ask why I let it go on so long. When I finished, she reached for my hand and gave it one gentle squeeze. "You already did it," she said. Nothing more. And in that moment, I knew exactly what she meant. This wasn't a story that needed fixing. It had already ended the moment I stopped trying to prove I belonged. I didn't need their approval. I didn't need another apology that came with strings. What I needed was here, a porch, a mug of tea, a person who had always seen me clearly. We sat in silence for a while, watching the rain tap against the windows. For once, it didn't feel sad. It felt clean, like something had finally washed off me that I didn't even know I was carrying. That night, as I curled up on the couch wrapped in an old quilt, I realized something. This was the first battle I'd won without raising my voice or defending my worth. The first war I didn't have to fight to feel whole. And somehow, that made it the biggest victory of all. I heard the reunion went on without me. The long table, the matching napkins, the stories recycled like clockwork. But in the center, right where I used to sit, there was one empty chair. No one called. No one asked if I'd changed my mind. And for the first time, I didn't even wonder if they would. I was across the state by then, back on base, standing in front of a group of fresh recruits. Their eyes were wide, unsure, looking at me like I knew what I was doing. And for once, I did. Every morning, I laced my boots, clipped my badge, and stepped into a space where my name meant something. Not because I gave, but because I showed up. Not because I stayed silent, but because I spoke with purpose. The world didn't stop turning after I walked away from them. It got quieter, sharper, mine. And I didn't fill that silence with guilt or regret. I let it stand, just like that empty chair. Sometimes peace doesn't come in the form of closure or forgiveness. It doesn't knock or ask permission. It shows up when you stop making space for people who only take. I never sent another letter, never scrolled through family photos online, never drove by the old house. I didn't need to, because peace isn't silence. It's knowing when not to answer the door.